So first of all, I'd like to introduce Edward Sykes from the UK Science Media, and he's going to deal with the question, how to handle controversy, food in the media.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad I've got the graveyard slot after lunch where everyone's falling asleep now. I'm going to talk about two different things. First of all, I'm going to tell you about the Science Media Centre itself, because without hearing about our little organisation, you won't really understand and appreciate where I'm coming from and why I'm saying the things I'm saying. And then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my suggestion of 7 key steps or things you can bear in mind if you're handling anything to do with controversy. So hopefully I'll be able to persuade you that I know a little bit about what I'm talking of. So the Science Media Centre is an organisation that the vast majority in the room have probably never heard of. It's an organisation that's a behind-the-scenes one that was set up back in 2002 following on headlines such as these. It was a time when the UK public was being misled and made incredibly confused about important issues such as BSE, such as GM crops, and such as the MMR vaccine. In fact, the implications of this were so big that the vaccination rates for the MMR vaccine had dropped from around just under 90% from before the scandals happened to only very recently it got it back up to that point. They dropped as low as 70% and children were dying as a result. Now, what happened was at the time, the House of Lords in the UK has a select committee into science and society, and they said, what could we possibly do that would enable the media to get a better understanding of the science that's going on? So they, instead of just going to the pro and anti campaign voices on whatever the issue is, they actually get the science into the headlines and actually get the public able to see what the scientific evidence says on whatever the topic is. They came up with a whole load of different suggestions, and one of those was to have an independent press office for the scientific community as a whole. So that's what we became. We're totally independent, and I'll talk about the funding shortly, but our remit is purely to ensure the accuracy of scientific coverage, and we deal in the controversial and the messy stories that other people aren't set up to handle, don't want to handle, or don't know how to handle. That's where we come in. So since we started up, we've been doing everything from animal research and fracking and GM crops and IVF, all the really, really controversial stuff, and inevitably that involves lots of things to do with food as well, whether it's GM or bisphenol A in bottles, or whether, of course, it's pesticides in farming or the horse meat scandal. And in every single occasion, we end up doing the same things. We have a tried and tested way of handling all of this, because for us, food is no different from any other controversial issue. That's one of the key messages I want you to kind of get hold of. It doesn't matter what the controversy is. The way in which you handle it and the way in which you prepare for it is exactly the same, no matter how emotive. But how do we actually do this? Well, the way that we think about this is that we will get the media to do science better when we get scientists to do the media better. By what I mean by that is the fact that when we were first set up, the scientific community was back up in its ivory tower. It was saying to journalists, it was honestly saying, when journalists would call up, they'd say, have you not read my paper? Go and read my research on this, and then you can come back to me with some sensible questions. And of course, that just didn't work. And nowadays, with the 24-hour rolling news media as it is, it's even more imperative that the right experts are willing to engage with journalists within half an hour, a couple of hours of a story breaking, or preferably before it breaks. I'll get onto that in a minute. So we work very closely with the 3 distinct groups, the journalists, the scientists, and the press officers at different organisations. And we have basically a massive database that's got 3,000 scientists on it from across the UK and a few from further afield, every single person of whom on that database has agreed that they don't mind us calling them up on a Saturday afternoon, on a Friday night, Monday morning, whenever it is, to say, look, this story is breaking, these journalists are going to be covering this story, please can you help us and give the journalists some guidance on this. And they've all said they're willing to do that. They may not do it, they may say, look, I can't do it, I'm not willing to do it, but there's someone else I can recommend. But they're willing, they've said that we can call them. We work very closely with the press officers because, of course, we can't be the experts on every single story, and we don't know the scientists who happen to have been researching for 20 years on a particular thing that has only just now hit the headlines for whatever reason. So we rely very heavily on the press officers at all the different organisations to know who the key people are, to keep us informed as well of the issues that are going to be coming up and what's going to be hitting the headlines in 3, 6, 9 months. And also very, very closely with the journalists. Now, the journalists, when you think of it, in the UK we're extremely lucky. I spent time at the Australian Science Media Centre as well, so I know just how lucky we are in that the journalists are all based in London, the vast majority of them. And in fact, if we call a press briefing, they can be round to our office within 10, 15 minutes. So we have that advantage that lots of other countries don't, so I want to put that out there straight away. But one of the key things is with the journalists is that we work with the specialists, the science, health and environment journalists who understand the stories, they understand the scientific method, and they've been following the stories for a while and they know what's happening, what's unfolding. And by keeping them informed before the stories even become an issue, then you can have a massive influence on how the stories actually kick off when they do hit the headlines. And when it's a big enough, huge enough story, then we get in touch with every single journalist we can find. So the ways in which we operate, media inquiries are kind of our bread and butter. We probably don't get that many compared to other institutions, and we bat a large number of them away. We bat away the ones where it's a fairly simple story or a good news story, or one where it's, why is the sky blue, that kind of thing, the general sciencey ones that you might get on commercial radio or something. But when it's a media inquiry about the toxic fumes from a couch, or whether or not a particular chemical that's been found in the horse meat is going to actually kill people, then we'll make sure that we move heaven and earth to try and find a scientist who will speak to the journalist straight away, whether they're from The Times or from The Sun or from the Daily Mail or from BBC or Sky or wherever it is, to try and make sure they'll speak to them and give them that guidance. Rapid reactions, these are when we issue statements from the scientists on whatever the topic is. We know that within half an hour, you saw the graphs earlier on how quickly you have to act. If we've got a statement from a top scientist, we will send it out far and wide so that all the journalists can see at a glance just a few sentences saying, this is the context, this is, you need to be scared or you don't, this is breaking news or it isn't, this is something to care about or not. Maybe it's just something that's of interest to the research community. And they put that in context and give it to there, and the journalists can use that, whether it's to quote directly from it, whether it's to call the scientist up and say, right, can I ask you some more questions about it, or whether it's because they have to go and give an interview in 2 minutes' time to a presenter who says to them, so can you tell us the latest on this situation? It informs them and the way in which they cover the story. It might even just be so they know whether or not it should be front page or page 7. The next thing we do is something called roundups, which is almost the same thing, except that it happens in advance of a story. We're lucky enough that we have good relationships with lots of the top journals in the world, and they send us the information about what they're going to be publishing often before they send it to the journalists. We get to look through that and see, there's a topic that's going to be interesting, that's going to be getting coverage, that journalists are going to want to know about. We send those papers on to scientists, the scientists of our database, who all abide by the embargoes. They don't send this on to anyone else. They read through it, they write a short summary, and we can then send it out to the journalists. So the journalists have the press release from the original journal that sent it out. They have these comments from independent scientists, and they have the paper, which hopefully they'll read, but often they won't. And that enables them to put the research into context and get an idea of, again, how big this is, whether it's worth covering or not, and often where the stories come from. But perhaps what we're most proud of is our media briefings, our press conferences. And we have now got to the stage where we run about 100 of these a year. So it's quite a large number, and our average number of journalists who turn up is 11 UK national journalists who turn up to each and every single one of our press conferences. And these aren't big showy affairs. It's literally a table at the front, a couple of experts talking about whatever the issue is, and they'll each speak for just a few minutes saying, this is the situation with the horse meat scandal, this is the situation with the crops, GM crops being trashed, or whatever the story is. And then the journalists have a Q&A with them for the rest of the hour. There's no spin, there's no kind of agenda, it's just the top experts being made available to the journalists who have then got to go out and feed this information back to the public. Funders, I wanted to mention this because everyone always asks, who gives your money, who has control of what you do? And the answer is that we maintain total independence ourselves. We have to, because otherwise the journalists wouldn't trust us. So we have about 100 different funders. If you have a look, it's split kind of equally between research bodies, between media organisations, between industry, government money. It's all in there. We take it for everyone, but we basically, it's always capped at 5%. So no one can have undue influence on what we do. The only exception is the Wellcome Trust, which is where we're housed in London. We get basically money in kind because we rent space off them. So now that I've talked to you a little bit about what we do, I just want to give you a few examples of things for each of you to take back to your own organisations, or hopefully you'll be able to say, yeah, that worked for us. Or when you end up having those arguments with people back in your own organisations about what you should or shouldn't be doing. So the first one to bear in mind on anything that happens with the media is that if you don't speak to the media, then someone else will. As was mentioned earlier, silence is the worst thing, and the moment there's a void, the moment there's a vacuum, it's going to be filled. Because no matter how much you don't want a story to be put into the news, it will be. A journalist has been told they've got to file their 4 or 5 stories a day, they've got to go and do this breaking story, whatever it is, and they are going to put something out there. Whether or not that's an interview with Aunt Maud down the road, or whether it's with a campaigner who spent the last 30 years looking at conspiracy theories about, Martians causing the E. coli outbreak, they will speak to someone who will give them that information because they've got to have a voice in there. And even if you're a government organisation and you're saying, well, we've given them this information, they will listen to that, but they still need to go and speak to someone else because they can't just say this is what the government said. So every single time the story will run and they will speak to someone. So if it's not your organisation or someone you can put them in touch with, it'll be someone else who probably won't be as useful or as expert in their understanding of the situation. The second thing is stick to the facts. The more controversial the topic, the more important it is to stick to the facts of what the research actually shows, what we can definitely say and what we can't say, to actually explain where the limitations of the knowledge are. This has already been mentioned today and it's a real key issue. And the more controversial it is, the more important it is to do that, particularly if you find yourself or a member of your organisation on TV or radio debating someone else. Because when that happens, the moment someone starts to stray from the science and from the facts and gets into an ideological debate or something else, then you've lost the argument because you just come across as a ranting, shouty person on the radio. Whereas if you're sat there talking about what the evidence shows, then the undecided people back home, was it non-sensitive mothers or something who were being shown earlier, they're the ones who'll be paying attention and they're the ones who'll be taking that information on board. You'll never convince the ultra-sensitive ones or the ones who aren't interested. Forget about them. There'll be a small proportion, and whatever you say, unless it's already in agreement with what they already know, you won't be able to persuade them. It's the people who are undecided, who just want to know more, that are the key people to get in touch with, and they will be receptive to what you say. Third thing, tell people as early as possible about whatever it is, and that's the good news and the bad. And that's really, really important, because if you're the organisation that is announcing, okay, we've found that we've actually got a slight hiccup in our processing thing of what we do, or we've found a chemical that could be problematic and which is why we're withdrawing it, or doing more tests or whatever it is, you have so much more trust and authority if you're the person who announces it and breaks that, rather than being an expose by some campaign group or by some investigative journalist who's done some really impressive investigative work where they've been sent a press release by a campaign organisation. So it's vital that you tell people what's going on, and as long as you're telling them the whole time, this is what we're doing and this is what we're doing about it and this is what we do know and this is what we don't know, then the public will be with you on this. Just 2 quick examples. First one, Science Media Centre news briefing on the health of nuclear power station workers. This was a massive piece of research where they were basically looking at whether or not working at a nuclear power station, which is obviously controversial in the first place, is more or less likely to kill you if you work there. So they were working with about 20,000 employees of these nuclear power stations, and the research showed that yes, it did increase the likelihood of having a heart attack if you worked at a nuclear power station. However, it was actually a very, very small risk of doing so, and it was much better to be employed by a nuclear power station than to be unemployed. So there was lots of caveats to this, and we knew this was going to be a big deal, and the journalists were waiting for the results of this research to come out. So we sat down with the scientists, we explained to them what would be the consequences of whatever they said and how to say it, and we ran the briefing, and the room was full. Journalists were there waiting for the story, and at the end of it, they actually said, well, that wasn't really a story at all. You know, it wasn't a big deal, and there were a few bits of coverage, and it was all done very nicely, and the science were happy, the staff were happy, and it was, you know, a good story in that sense. It was still bad news. It just wasn't the front page, and never should have been a front page story. Similar one, health threat of nanotubes, which may be similar to asbestos. This was a piece of research where scientists looking at nanotechnology were basically saying that if you have bits of carbon nanotubes that are a certain size and shape, it could have the same impact as asbestos does. And once again, this was a few years ago, and this was back in the time when nanotechnology was very first being discussed, and the journalists would have been really appreciative of a fantastic bad news story of just how nanotechnology was going to kill us all. The scientists said, look, we found this, we've done the research, and now we can say as long as we don't use this size and shape of nanotube, then we're going to be okay. So the journalists came along, they heard this, and it was the specialist science and health journalists who were listening, and it comes back with a good, solid piece of work, and the article that was written was very measured. And as a result, there hasn't been this same furore, I can't say it's just because of this, but there hasn't been the same furore around nanotechnology as there has been about so many other things, because we know that the science and health journalists in the UK anyway are up on this. They're clued up on the story, they understand it, and they're kind of aware of what's going on. So working with specialist journalists, this number 4, you have to remember this. If you're working with the Daily Mail in the UK normally gets a groan and everyone goes about how shockingly bad it is. But if you work with the science correspondent or the health correspondent at the Daily Mail, you get a completely different response and a completely different article. And in fact, if you show people just the text from different ones, they often wouldn't be able to tell you which one was from which outlet. I cannot overemphasize enough just how important it is to have a good relationship with these specialist journalists. The general news reporters, the consumer affairs reporters, the political reporters who are just coming on to a science story for the first day that month or that year even, won't understand all the background behind it, and you'll get a completely different outcome. The 5th thing, and I've got to speed up because I know I'm running out of time, always mention relative and absolute risk. Just saying that something is 50 times as big or as bad or as harmful or as good or whatever it is isn't actually that important if the risk is going from 0.002 to 0.001, if you see what I mean. So it's always that context, that relative risk is vital to have in there. And if we're not talking about it the whole time, then the journalists won't understand it, won't be talking about it, and won't be used to listening to it as well. Number 6, talk and talk and talk. It's vitally important that you don't just go, okay, we're going to do our one little media campaign on whatever this is, and then we just let the issue lie. You've got to take every single opportunity to stand up and talk about the issues. The particularly good example is on human-animal hybrid embryos. There was essentially going to be a investigation by government as to whether or not they would change the law and allow this research to happen or not. Massive campaign groups, the Catholic Church massively against it in the UK. It was a story that was actually started by the scientific community, though, the moment they got wind of it. And every single time they got some new research out, they talked about it again. Every single time there was a campaign or piece of news, whatever it was, they would stand up and say, look, this is why we think we need to be able to do this research. This is why it's not actually the yuck factor you think. This is why this, and so on and so on. And as a result, the law was actually changed, and they were allowed to do the research, and it was a fantastic good news story for the scientific community. As it turns out, it hasn't actually produced that much science, but they never said it would, but they've still been able to go down that route of finding it out. And number 7, my final one, is to remember that every single story is an opportunity. No matter how bad news the story seems to be, you can still influence. So on August the 13th, there was published in the Daily Telegraph an interview with Prince Charles, who was talking about how GM would cause the UK landscape to be turned into a car park. The next day, all the headlines were of scientists condemning Prince Charles for his statements, and you got to have big articles talking about the facts about GM. So any story can be turned around. So that's the 7 rules. If you don't speak to the media, someone else will. Stick to the facts. Tell people as early as possible. Work with the specialist journalists. Really get to know them. Always discuss the relative and absolute risk. And keep talking and talking and talking, and use every single opportunity, no matter how bad news a story it is. Now, The SMC is a UK organisation. We're dedicated for working with the UK national media, but there are other SMCs around the world. There's ones in Australia, New Zealand, potentially going to be ones in Europe, one in Japan. There's talk of one being set up in the US. And we're always on hand to give people advice, and we're willing to discuss things if we can. But I must emphasise that we are a very small team, there's only 8 of us, and so we are restricted to working with UK national stuff as a priority where we have to. So yeah, thank you very much.